Welcome back. There was, of course, a violent tabloid reaction this week after the High Court's decision to give Parliament a vote over when Article 50 is evoked, calling the judges, in some papers, enemies of the people. Well, Theresa May says she will appeal against the decision in the Supreme Court. But is the rhetoric around the whole legal process getting out of hand? Well, let's talk now to Hilary Benn, Chair of Parliament's Exiting the EU Select Committee. A very good morning to you, Mr. Benn. If it goes to the Supreme Court and it's upheld there, that decision, do you fear that the reaction may get worse?
I think it's really important that we're all clear about what the court judgment actually meant. As you've rightly said, it's an important decision, but it was simply a decision about who presses the Article 50 button, who formally starts the process of Britain leaving the European Union. And the court has ruled that it should be Parliament rather than the government using the royal prerogative power. We have the appeal. We shall have to wait the outcome of that. But it was not a decision about whether we are leaving the European Union, because we will be leaving. Now, I campaign very hard for Remain, but we are Democrats and we have to accept the outcome of the referendum. And the task now is to try and get the best possible deal for Britain.
OK, well, let's fast forward and assume that it is upheld at the Supreme Court. Your committee then has a huge say, does it not, in how Parliament will approach discussions about what the red lines, what the demands are when Article 50 is triggered?
Well, indeed, the committee's got an important task. I mean, we haven't yet, of course, had a chance to consider the Article 50 judgment, but when we met on Wednesday, we agreed our inquiry. We're going to look into what should be the UK's negotiating objectives, what kind of future economic and political relationship we should seek with the European Union after we have left, whether there is a case or not for transitional arrangements. Because when you think about it, Dermot, if Article 50 is triggered at the end of March, as the government says it wants, we have, of course, the French and the German elections next year. So it's possible to argue that serious negotiations won't be able to begin probably until the autumn, after the German elections are out of the way. And that could leave us with just over a year and a half in which to sort out, first of all, the divorce settlement, because that's the formal bit of the Article 50 process. But secondly, trying to reach agreement on what our future trading and market access arrangements with the 27 member states are going to be. So we'll also be looking at the government's capacity to handle this negotiation, because it's going to be an extremely complex task, as you know.
And clarify for us, Mr. Benn, if you could, your party, the Labour Party's position on the actual triggering of Article 50. If we understand what your leader, what Mr. Corbyn's been saying this morning in the Sunday Mirror newspaper, it is a red line that access to the single market is maintained, and if that is not one of the demands, then you will try to make sure that Article 50 is not triggered.
Well, Jeremy has also said, and I think it's the view of the vast majority of Labour MPs, that we respect the outcome of the referendum, and the only way in which you can start the process of leaving is to trigger Article 50. But what Jeremy's set out, access to the single market, protecting workers' rights that we've had from the European Union, things like health and safety, working time, paid holiday, rights for part-time and agency workers, ensuring that consumer protection, environmental laws that are so important for our country continue to apply, and making sure that capital investment that would have been coming, that won't now arrive because we're leaving the European Union, think of investment in the regions, some work on science and universities, that all of those are going to be maintained, and that should be part of the negotiating objectives of the government. Now, when you look at that list, they're all really, really sensible things. What I cannot conceive of is circumstances in which for the next 5 months the government is going to remain silent about what its negotiating objectives are up until the moment when the Article 50 is invoked, because I don't see how the people of this country, nor indeed Parliament, would be able to accept that. It is perfectly reasonable for us to say to the government, look, what is the plan? Because there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of questions that people want answered, Dermot. And I'll give you a very good example of how greater certainty helps. When Nissan announced recently that it wasn't going to invest any more money in its plant in Britain without assurances about what the future may hold. Quite rightly, the government gave commitments about what it was going to seek in those negotiations. That unlocked Nissan's decision to build 2 new models in its plant in Washington in the northeast. So for motor vehicle manufacturing in Britain, we now know what the government's objectives are.
Okay.
It is therefore perfectly reasonable for other industries to say, well, what are your objectives for us and for the service sector, which accounts for 80% of our economy, 1 million people work in financial services.
OK, I mean, we got the list, Mr Benn, of the demands, access to the single market, protection of workers' rights, etc. But what happens if they're not part of the government's negotiating position? What actions will the Labour Party take? Mr Corbyn seems to be saying he would try to block Article 50 being triggered.
Well, he's also said that we will uphold the result of the referendum. And I think that is very important, because I don't think any of us can get into a position where a majority of people having voted to leave the European Union, and I very much regret that. The Labour Party, as you know, campaigned very hard for Remain. We have to respect that decision. What I'm saying to you, Dermot, is I don't see that how it's going to possibly get to that point, because it is impossible to envisage circumstances in which for the next 5 months the government is not going to set out for Parliament what its negotiating plan and objectives are. I think that it would be unacceptable to Parliament and indeed to the people. We can't have 5 months of silence as the government prepares to go into the single most important negotiation the country has faced for decades. It isn't going to happen.
OK. Hilary Benn, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed.